Thank you to Eric as well for convening this. And I want to take a special moment to say that Eric is a big thinker with big questions and big answers. And he also seems to have a whole lot of people in his life who think similarly. So it's a pleasure to be joined by several of them this morning. And it's my hope not just to focus up in the clouds in those big questions, but to come down to planet Earth and specifically to planet America, and to think about what it is that we're fighting for, and why, and how, and should we. We could talk about things like what is democracy, what have we lost, and what's happening in this world. Why can't we talk across our lines with each other anymore? There's a lot to bemoan. And the gentlemen up here have expertise across all of the important societal institutions and mechanisms by which we can answer those questions, whether it's cybersecurity and social movements, cultural politics, global social change, generational change, connectedness among societies, and so on. Again, big questions, big ideas, enormous concepts. But I'd like each of these gentlemen to speak for just a few minutes each to give you a sense of how they're looking at these questions. And after we've had the chance to hear what fills their minds, I'd like to ask each other questions and very much hope to hear from all of you as well. So in the grand tradition of alphabetical order, Joel, would you start us off?
Thank you, Tracy. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really congratulate Eric on convening this group to think about these critical issues for both our generation and those that are coming behind us. I focus on technology, and I'll make 3 points. The first is that I think the online technical infrastructure that we have today has put us in a transformational moment for law and governance in our society. We see through the technology tremendous opportunities for public engagement, for improvements in government efficiency. At the same time, we see the technologies creating enormous challenges for society's commitment to the rule of law. It leads to my second point, which is that I think the online technologies, our infrastructure, is not compatible with traditional democracy. I think it's unraveling basic prerequisites that we have for democracy, specifically privacy, freedom of association, and our ability to have effective oversight of government in our traditional ways. We can think of things quite simply. Network functionality. The network will not function without monitoring. It's a feature of the system. Well, that means that you can't have the kind of freedom of association that has historically been important in our society. And I think, for example, of NAACP versus Alabama, very famous civil rights case, where the Supreme Court held that our ability to anonymously associate with others, free from the government or third parties knowing it, is fundamental to democracy. Well, that doesn't work in today's online infrastructure. It can't. Oversight of government. The government no longer has a monopoly on the use of force to assure law and order and rule of law. The technologies enable or democratize that in ways that cut against how we've thought about it for traditional democracy. So my third point, and my optimism in all of this, is that I think this means we're in a moment where we need to see a realignment. We need to see new kinds of mechanisms emerge that will enable us to assure public accountability in the digital society, that give us ways of achieving greater good, supporting public values that will be more complex than our historical legislative, executive branch, judiciary approach. And I think this is going to be essential for us going forward in the world.
Would you go to Mackie, please? Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Joel. I think you'll hear a lot of similar themes today. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that have been on my mind with regards to this issue. So I think I look at it a little bit differently than Joel does, although I actually agree with a lot of Joel's key points. But I view the evolution that we are experiencing right now in terms of medium of communication and medium of interaction with institutions as just that, as an evolution. In a way, you can take a look over the last several generations and mark a generation by the primary media or channel through which they experienced their kind of formative period. So that'd be from, call it 7 years old to 30 years old. If you take a look at the boomer generation, which is the biggest generation out there, and then the evolution between the boomer generation and the current generation, the millennials, I don't really like either of those terms, but this is still a useful architecture. What you see is that media is essentially a form of convex or even flat mirror. It's a mirror that starts out when it's a simple one-way media. That's a mirror that looks a lot just like who we want to believe we are. As the technology improves in our ability to individually and as a society interact with one another's emotions, the mirror gets better over time. We haven't fundamentally changed from the time when Martin's father was doing the good work with my parents and everyone else to bring about the civil rights movement. But the mirror that is the media through which we communicate has gotten better over time, and we don't really like what we see. That's the problem. The reason we, and this is those of us who are not born into a realm of social media, don't like it as much, is because we weren't born into it. It's a strange picture of society to us. It is not to those 10 years younger than me. And so what I find very interesting is I think it's going to be, there's almost an event horizon. We can't really tell, to your point about the evolution of what the institutions are going to become, can't really tell what they're going to be. We can see hints of things in Google and Facebook likes and all these other things, but we can't tell what they're going to change into over time. They will change. They have to change. But I don't think that the means through which democracy is communicated ultimately changes the idea of democracy itself. I understand the concerns about surveillance, but I also see that social platforms themselves, there are big platforms, but there are also very small platforms that are much more conducive to association without surveillance. There's an entire dark web, which is mostly full of criminal activity, that prevents that type of surveillance now. So I don't fear the evaporation of privacy. Privacy evolves over time, just the way all the other things do based on the medium through which things are communicated. I actually see the current platform environment as something that's almost potentially an apotheosis of the demos idea, one in which there's a more perfect relationship between how we feel and how we govern ourselves. Whether that's a good thing is not entirely clear, but I think that's what's going to happen. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Mark.
Thanks for having me here today, and thanks for everyone's really interesting, insightful comments already. I'd like to encourage everyone in the audience to take a moment and think about your own social universe, all the people that you know in the course of your life, and try to organize them on a model that looks like the rings of Saturn. So your most intimate contacts, the people you know best, your spouses, your best friends, your children, your parents, are in the innermost rings. And then the outermost rings are people you know only marginally, maybe across a single plane of interest. I think something really profound has happened over the course of the last 40 years. And that is that Americans and people in developed democracies around the world have been given the power to spend much more of their time and attention in the innermost rings. So when I go on a business trip, I often FaceTime with my children. I'm in touch with my wife all through the day in ways that my grandparents would never have imagined. And secondly, we're empowered to have many more relationships with people in the outermost ring. So I often say to people that I am one of 17 Cincinnati Bengals fans in the entire world, and we all know each other now. And if I lived in Providence, Rhode Island, 25 years ago, it's very, very hard for me to interact with people about the Cincinnati Bengals. What's been lost in the wash are what I call middle ring relationships. And these are relationships with people who are familiar but not intimate, people with whom, if you met them on a street, you'd be able to have a conversation with them about something more profound than the weather. I think that those middle ring relationships are essentially the foundation beneath what was American democracy. So that there is a fundamental need, the only way for you to be able to break out of the bubble of your own experience is to have these sorts of conversations across the middle rings, whether it's at a PTA meeting with someone who voted for the other, voted for the other presidential candidate, or whether it's in a coffee shop, or whether it's in a bowling league, as Robert Putnam would have argued a couple of decades ago, and that those sorts of interactions are fundamental to your ability to invest in an institution that mediates between various interests, so that the fundamental, where I'm going with this is to sort of suggest that we've got a series of complaints about Washington and why Washington isn't working, why there hasn't been a grand bargain, I think, since the 1997 balanced budget agreement between the parties. And we talk about the filibuster and gerrymandering and polarized media and money in politics and lobbyists. We've got a whole series of complaints that are frequently on the op-ed page. None of those institutions are new, right? Gerrymandering is literally named after James Madison's vice president, right? The filibuster rules existed as they were from the early 70s until the nuclear option a couple of years ago. That hadn't changed, but filibustering had increased. But it's not because the rules had changed, right? In 1916, Pierre DuPont was so incensed that Woodrow Wilson is opposed to personal income tax that he gave $100,000 to Wilson's opponent. It's a lot of money in 1916. It's a lot of money now. So none of these institutions are new. What is new is that these middle ring relationships had withered, and that was where you began to understand the other side. And so that's the big change, and the question is, if the foundation beneath which American democracy thrives has shifted, what are we going to do about it?
Michael?
There's a great problem with going last, and that is there's more and more that I want to say in light of all the great comments that have already been made. But if I may, I would like to begin just by referencing Martin Luther King III's speech. And that is that I recognize the profound continuities between your father's era and today, but it's not always mediated, obviously, through our national lens. I went to Poland in 1983 in order to study the Solidarity movement of 1980-81. And that movement was profoundly influenced by your father's struggle because it was able to realize democracy in Poland and by extension, the rest of the communist bloc, by its commitment to nonviolence. And that struggle for nonviolence, the culture of nonviolence within a struggle for democracy is absolutely central to anything we talk about today. So thank you very much for that. I would, in the tradition of threes, let me just say three things. The first is I want to talk about object. The second, I want to talk about depth. And the third, I want to talk about place. Object. One of the biggest problems I think we have in talking about democracy is not that we disagree about what it means. It was that we tend to talk about whether we have it or whether we don't. Is Trump an authoritarian or is he a Democrat? This is the wrong question. We should be asking instead, to what extent does this practice or this practice or this practice deepen democracy or lessen democracy? When Martin Luther King Jr. talked about bringing more people into the voting booth, he was spreading democracy, he was deepening democracy, he was broadening the electorate. When he was struggling on behalf and with sanitation workers, he was creating greater conditions of equality. These things are the foundation of democracy's deepening. We have to remember that. Second, depth. one of the things people talk about all the time right now is the vitriol on the media, is the ways in which Twitter seems to inspire hate. I agree. But I think that's the scum on the surface. I think we need to look deeper into what is creating the conditions for this. It's not only that electronic media allows this, it's also because our societies, and I think this is the deepest point, our societies are even more unequal today than they were in the late 1960s. The degree of economic inequality within the United States and within the world is growing. And one of the things that democracy suffers for is that it has no answers to this kind of challenge. That's the rule of the marketplace. Well, in fact, it's not. It's the rule of the people deciding how they want the marketplace to function. Leads to point number 3. One of the reasons why I feel democracy is at risk is not because of Twitter and not because of inequality, but because of the loss of hope. Why are we losing hope? Because of the sense of overwhelming proportion the complexity of the world invites us to consider. These are wicked problems in the technical sense that we must deal with. But there are ways to deal with wicked problems by shrinking them in scale, by thinking about addressing one issue in order to address another. And here I'm just going to conclude with this obvious point. I'm a professor at Brown University. Brown University is one of the richest universities in this country, in this world. Not quite like Harvard, I know, but I think we compare it to other places, we'll do all right. But Brown, with 20% of its students coming from the top 1% of the United States, and if you add to that those who come from the most privileged sectors of the world, we have enormous social and economic capital at Brown University. Does Brown University live in Providence? Yeah. Is it an active citizen of Providence and not just a resident of Providence? I'm not so sure. I think Brown's getting better. But one of the things that is a great opportunity now is to think about to what degree could Brown partner with other educational institutions, with other foundations, with other government agencies, and with various citizen groups in order to realize the democracy that's possible on the local level, even when it seems difficult to realize on the greater level. So I want to conclude with a note of hope, because I think that's happening right here, right now, and will happen ever more in the future. Thank you.
Concluding with hope. Phew, thank you. I was listening to all of you, and I appreciate you. They followed the rules. I asked them to be brief. Thank you. That's very appreciated. But I want to, in almost a round-robin fashion, I would like to mention something that I feel is dominant in our conversations, dominant in the news, and dominant in public policy arenas right now, and that is Facebook. It is well known that it is obviously the richest company, Mark Zuckerberg, Harvard. We all know the origin stories. We all know the role that we now know it played in the election interference of 2016 with the Russian government and other actors. We also know that the federal government is gravely concerned, and there's an unprecedented number of lobbyists who have been hired in Washington to represent Facebook. I'd like all of your thoughts on where Facebook fits in the conceptualizations that you've presented today, defending democracy, and here comes Facebook. What say you? Is it a middle ring?
I think Facebook is exhibit A for why we're seeing these democratic challenges. I really liked the description of the middle ring and its missing feature. Facebook, I think, is one of the causes of that. Why? Because it creates filter bubbles. The technologies, we're not operating in an anodyne technological environment. Facebook, Twitter, most of the social media platforms are technologically architected to manipulate behavior in one way or another. So for example, Facebook is architected so that people will overshare. And there have been a series of very well done studies of that. When that happens, it means that you create echo chambers, you create groups talking to each other that very rapidly will prey on human emotions and ratchet up into a lather a particular problem. What's surprising to me, in a way, about the reaction to the political advertising is privacy advocates have been complaining about these issues on Facebook for years, about the way Facebook does profiling, sells ads, and the way those ads can be used to manipulate people. Yet, there was no reaction. We don't know if there are other forms and other actors in the past election that used Facebook in similar ways. The only one we know about right now is Russia. Mm-hmm. I would not be surprised if other organizations were doing the same thing, if other political campaigns domestically were also using Facebook ads that way. It turns out, for example, the University of Virginia has been using Facebook ads to try to sway the legislators, individual legislators in Virginia, to support the university. So there are other actors that have been doing the same thing. And it's architected to be hidden from public view, which I think is a problem for us, especially on the accountability side.
So I don't think I disagree with the fear. I guess I wanted to call something to the fore and just say that essentially all advertising-driven media are built to adjust human behavior. They all are, unless you're paying directly for content, whether it was the television starting in the 50s to newspapers, which are all ad-driven. Newspapers are a little different just because they had classifieds as well until they went away because of Craigslist. But at the end of the day, just going back to the original point, we're just getting better at it. We've crossed, I think, possibly a threshold of capability in terms of manipulation, which should ring a lot of alarm bells. But it's not a new thing, and it is something that I think can be addressed given a popular will to address it, or Facebook will die. That's the other thing. I mean, there's a market here to some extent. And I was just talking earlier with someone who was talking about the changes in Facebook's behavior, or Twitter was a great example. So what was happening with ISIS, Twitter ads were showing up in these screenshots of ISIS's propaganda, and Twitter was losing advertisers left and right. And so they shifted very quickly from in 2015 saying we're never going to edit content to the second Coca-Cola called and said we're stopping our ads until you can figure out a way to not pair them with ISIS or whatever. And the same thing was happening to Facebook. They're very quickly editing content in order to prevent that from happening. Again, still driven by the fact that the money is coming from advertisers, and that's always been the case for media. It's essentially been a hidden hand for a very long time, but the hand is no longer hidden, and now we've got to deal with it.
Michael, I'm curious your response to Mackie's saying.
Well, in response to both of my colleagues up here, I think it's true that we have to worry about the technical aspects of social media, but we need to think about them in relation to other things that are happening. So I would propose simply that these things that are dangerous about Facebook are real, but we also have to think about the ways in which this can be a tool for achieving greater social good and social justice. And I can think of two examples right now. One is there was a big contest in Europe several years ago over intellectual property rights. And in fact, through social media, this was largely mobilized in order to translate what would be individual atomized positions into a larger social movement. The danger, of course, is that to the extent that we rely only on social media to do our mobilization, this is ephemeral. We mobilize here and then we disappear. Zeynep Tufekci at University of North Carolina has a beautiful book on Twitter and tear gas out that talks about this. Mm-hmm. The second point is that these problems are not unknown to people who are learning right now within computer science. One of the things I would just point out is Vandana Ravi in this room, as well as Ruby Goldberg, are mobilizing students from across the country and within Brown University to think about how it is that we can mobilize computer science competencies for the public good, instead of just automatically having them go off to Google and to Facebook and to lucrative careers. This is one of the things that's extraordinary to me. There is a public spirit among this generation, and they are using the tools that enable them to address it.
Mm-hmm. And Mark?
So I want to address it in a slightly different way. Having Martin Luther King III in the room, one question that I think, and this sort of speaks to your point, Michael, is that since the modern civil rights movement, or really since the late 60s, early 70s, we haven't seen a movement with that sort of impact. What's changed? Well, one thing, we certainly had these sort of blips. We had the Occupy movement a few years ago. To your point, it's sort of, like there's no Voting Rights Act, right, that we can ascribe to the Occupy movement. What was different? The modern civil rights movement was born in explicitly middle ring institutions. The SCLC was an organization of clergy who knew each other with not necessarily with great intimacy, but they knew each other well enough that they were passing ideas, and that the individual members of the clergy had middle ring relationships with their congregations. Those were sustainable relationships. They lasted. They were deeper than a single plane of agreement. It wasn't just that they were angry about discrimination on the bus in Montgomery. They had a whole series of relationships, and that the depth of that relationship let them sustain a long-term effort to move towards the greater good. That's not to minimize the charismatic leadership or the fact that they had real injustice sort of fueling their move, but that's a fundamentally different relationship than people who see each other and are commenting on Twitter or on Facebook or on and they come together very briefly because they're angry about the bonuses given during on Wall Street during the height of the financial crisis, or they are desperate to have a new bike lane installed in there, and so there are all sorts of advantages to this new phenomenon where we are able to be sort of a gig social movements, right? Where rather than people being sort of invested in the long term, we all invest temporarily because we're angry about one issue or another, and then go off on our ways. But there's something lost in the wash. And I think that's a powerful, just comparing the architecture, the social architecture of the modern civil rights movement to the various movements that have existed since. You see a real change in that, and I think that mitigates some of our ability. Absolutely, it's terrific that oncologists around the world were able to share information on the web, or that people who are all angry about, the latest thing that some official in the Trump administration did can all converse about that. But there's something lost in the sort of institutions that existed in previous generations.
I'm reminded of the creatively named Women's March that happened in January of this year. And in the period from Election Day up until that march in January, there was a flurry of activity online, a lot of it. Maybe some of you have the little pink hats. And I want to share from a very sort of behind closed doors vantage perspective that there was considerable concern in Washington among the traditional organizations who typically plan and produce things like a large-scale march. People were very nervous that there was this buzz that a march was happening because, quote, they hadn't been part of the planning. And indeed, what you saw was a very organic effort, really born out of a few living rooms in Brooklyn with several women who then sort of got several more women, and because of primarily Facebook and other digital social media channels, the march became what it was. But meanwhile, back in Washington, you had people really bordering on freaking out because they were saying, did they get permits? Do they have the insurance necessary? How come they haven't called Cecile Richards yet and asked her to speak? And there were real panicked women leaders who felt very disengaged from what this march was going to be. And as the march drew closer and closer, suddenly some of those more entrenched and expected and traditional organizations sort of inserted themselves into the process. And indeed, what you saw at that march was much more of an amalgamation of that organic Brooklyn living room to the Cecile Richards. But I can tell you with certainty that the period from Election Day to the march was filled with tremendous angst by those people who think, well, we're the ones who plan marches, not you guys. And someday that story will be told in a much more academic way and with far more detail and far more profanity. But I can assure you that there was concern. And so to see what happened for all of you, whether you were there or you consumed via media, it was an extraordinary outcome, that march. And it wasn't because of the traditional channels being followed. And the lessons I think that people are still learning from what happened there go well beyond what you would call a, quote, women's march, and have everything to do with the state of participatory democracy and where we are in this age of Trump and how people are seeking associations and what it meant that a plane from Seattle would be filled with women all in their hats, all flying to Washington, most of whom didn't even know each other, and they were all coming from the same city. So the underlying stories there, I think all of you are speaking to, and I feel I would be remiss to not make it come alive with the example of what happened with the Women's March. And so thank you for indulging me there, because that's not a question. Unless, if you'd like to respond, I'm happy to hear it. But I did have,
Tracy,
yes, please.
That really highlights, I think, this tension between traditional institutions and the way they function, because you're describing the traditional women's organizations and their role in political participation, historically, meaning over perhaps the last 30, 40 years, is being challenged by a viral activity online. You had the group of women in Brooklyn, their online conversation goes viral and now creates something that the traditional institution didn't know how to deal with at first. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing the same thing happen with the Nazis marching in Charlottesville. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the same, they're able to use the online tools for very corrosive activity in our society. And we don't yet understand, I think, how do we frame that? How do we see it? How do we structure it so that it is for good rather than evil? And I think I'm going to come back to a point you made earlier about, well, the market's going to correct Facebook. I don't think that's right. And I don't think in our society we want the dollars to be the driver for political participation, for civil rights and civil liberties and public values in our society. I don't think we should rely on the advertisers to be telling Facebook how they should behave in our society. I think it's a real problem because from a legal perspective, we have the First Amendment. We can't regulate Facebook content. Yet Facebook, as a dominant platform, and as a platform that structures through its algorithms how so many people view the world, is an extremely powerful manipulating force in our society. And I don't think we have any idea yet how we're going to provide checks and balances for it.
Mm-hmm. Checks and balances, much less defense. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of talk recently about how the 20th century was really the last period of creation of civic and public organizations, that everything from various federal programs that are now 100 plus years old versus today where we see so much happening in the private sector. We have a transportation problem, well, now we have Uber. now we have Lyft, and so forth. And the notion that public society and public institutions are no longer willing, able, or care to innovate the way that the private sector has. Would any of you like to comment on that relationship?
So, not to become the optimist on the panel, but I think one of the most important things is to be able to name a problem. We can solve all sorts of problems which are superficial. And one of the things that I feel like has happened in the last several years, which gives me terrific optimism, is that social movements have stepped up and said, this is a problem. Occupy, to my mind, was an enormously successful movement because it put inequality on the agenda. Black Lives Matter is an enormously successful movement because it puts something on the agenda people try to erase. So one of the reasons I think that we're having trouble solving problems is because we're accustomed to solving problems that don't involve the substantial reorganization of institutions and reallocation of resources. But in these times, one of the things we have to do is put on an agenda. And this is why both Trump and Bernie Sanders were appealing, because they said there's something broken when we're trying to manage a system that is broken. We need to think deeper and be more courageous and have the civic vision that extends beyond what is happening today to anticipate what ought to be tomorrow.
Yes, yes, applaud. Other hopefuls, yay, Team Hope.
To that point, I mean, I think, how to say this, all of the problems that you've left us are invisible, ubiquitous, require total and complete system change to fix, and demand a platform like Facebook and other things in order to shift them. So I work in the world of climate change, and I actually had a conversation with Gina McCarthy, who was the EPA administrator at the time. We were riding around Connecticut, and she was talking about the successes of the EPA, and I said, yeah, but look what you've left me. You left me with all the hard ones. Like, you fixed all the stuff that's smoky and boiling and you can see the river set on fire. All that stuff is easy to fix because you can point a single piece of policy at it and make it go away. When you were talking about, precisely to your point, a reallocation of wealth and resources, a total systemic change in the way capital is moved back and forth, that's a much harder problem, and the channels and modes of interaction that we had up until this point were insufficient to either identify or drive change against those problems because they were all hidden. Again, going back to my earlier point, the mirror is getting better. And when the mirror gets better, everything gets harder because it has to, but that's what's left.
I understand that the Trump administration's EPA reposted a trove of climate change related web pages. They just removed the word climate. I would really like to engage all of you. If you have a question, please either shout it out or find our microphone, which I thought Eric may have had. Yes.
Yeah, I'll make my way around here to anybody who's got a question. I wanted to start with a question for the panel too. And I'm going to engage one of our guests here in a moment directly in this. I'm going to raise him in two ways, my friend Carl Struble. First of all, I want to encourage everybody to pick up on Joel's comment about Facebook is architected to get you to overshare. I want the next half hour here to be architected to overshare. So please, everybody, overshare. That's what we're here for. I was talking with Carl last night after things adjourned, and he had the same reaction that most people get to whenever I start talking about these issues, which was he said he wanted to go upstairs, get into bed, and pull the covers up over his head because you start talking about where the world's headed in the 21st century and it sounds scary and horrible. I actually don't think it's scary and horrible, it's just different. And I wanted to ask the panelists to react to this. I mean, a lot of, not everybody, we had some glimmers of hope here, but a lot of what we were hearing from you was about how, how awful it is. Facebook is destroying democracy, and so is the rest of social media. In fact, the origins of this particular panel come out of a remark that folks at Brown made to me last year in the wake of the election about the university's interest in making a theme of its activities this year defending democracy, which is obviously a reaction to the shock of the Trump election. And implicit in all of this, all these discussions about the Russian election and social media, this whole notion of defending democracy. Democracy is under assault today, and obviously we see it eroding in a lot of ways around the world. But to pick up on Tracy's comment about the Women's March, and that you had the traditional leadership looking at what was happening and saying, this is awful, we're the people who do this, who are the rest of these people to say, well, we want to do this now? Well, the rest of these people are people, and isn't that what democracy is? In a lot of ways, aren't we looking at not the death of democracy per se, but maybe a difference in democracy, that these technologies are in fact democratizing the world in a very, very profound way? And this seems threatening to people who are used to being at the top of what is democracy, but we're not seeing so much the erosion of democracy as a very, very different kind of democracy in all kinds of different avenues. Why isn't that the case? Why isn't that a hopeful thing? Isn't it great that the Women's March is being organized by people other than the Cecile Richards? Nothing against Cecile Richards. So I'd like all of you to comment on that.
Yes, it is. I mean, I say it that way because that was kind of my point in my last one. But I do think it's worth making that it's not all good or bad, right? It's a mirror, so it shows both sides of things. But there's certainly a huge amount of hope in my heart for the future because of platforms like this.
I think it's a terrific question, and I think the Women's March is a powerful example. I'm glad you brought it up. There is, I think, a fundamental shift here in that you're talking about a conversation between sort of the establishment groups and the constituency that they claim in many cases to represent. Mm-hmm. The power of the modern civil rights movement was that Martin Luther King Jr. was not only speaking to the people in his own community, but that he was reaching out beyond it, and that he reawakened a lot of white Americans, right? The March to Selma, people saw those pictures, and they were in their living rooms, wherever it was, in Boston and Providence and Chicago, wherever they were, and it awakened them to something that was happening. They weren't talking to one another. It wasn't that people in the African American community who were the subject of prejudice and discrimination were talking to one another. It's that they were reaching out and emotionally pulling people in. I'm looking at polling in places like Kent County, Rhode Island, which is working class, voted overwhelmingly for Obama and then overwhelmingly for Trump. It's a pretty clear marker like Macomb County, Michigan, or Stark County, Ohio, or Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, of people who are sort of, I don't know if they're swing voters, but their views are changing. It's unclear to me whether the most effective of a strategy of people who are pursuing the greater good, if the Women's March brought those people with them, right? Whether Black Lives Matter brings those people with them in the way that the modern civil rights movement clearly did, right? It was targeted to change people's minds by reaching out to them and make sort of and exposing them to something that they wouldn't otherwise see. The medium of having a Walter Cronkite sort of figure, a New York Times, these are explicitly institutions that are built to bridge differences in society. Facebook is not, right? Twitter is not. Like in most cases, these are mediums that are designed to help people within a certain viewpoint in the outer rings talk to one another. And I think that's a powerful difference. It has. I'm sorry to rain on Eric's parade, but it has some benefits, right? It's terrific that many women were able to get together, and it was a powerful and cathartic moment. I'm not sure that we're better off today than we were when that march happened. Probably we are in some ways, but I mean, I don't read the paper and feel tremendously hopeful all the time. And I think that this is a really important shift and something for us to be aware of and concerned about.
So, just to introduce a little bit of disagreement.
Great.
So, 3 points, and not to mansplain by any means.
Your words.
And I know, but I'm cognizant. So one of the things that I take as terrific inspiration from the Women's March is not all that led to it, but all that might lead from it. Because one of the things that is an effect of that momentous occasion are all of these local lists of people who might be mobilized for local government engagement. So that's point number one, building on that. But that suggests a method. And that is that we should not look at social media in isolation from all the other things that are happening. And it's not just about how we use social media for various kinds of mobilizations, but it's also to think about how the information and communication technological revolution not only created social media, but it enabled the financialization of the economy, which is one of the principal drivers of growing inequality in society. So the very same thing that produces more capacity for communication also produces the capacity for the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, to become increasingly isolated. Third point, one of the things that I think is remarkable about the times in which we live is that the terms on which we have conversations with one another are changing. One of the things that I am learning powerfully in all of my movement participation, in all of my conversations on campus, is that the terms on which I think we ought to agree and therefore find common ground are actually part of the problem. You know, when white privilege winds up defining what the common ground is, that's actually part of the conversation that's going on. And this is one of the reasons why people are saying we can't talk to one another. I frankly find the courage of those who are taking a knee at these NFL games to mark a problem to be an example of what it is we need to do. And for those who are saying, oh, this is disrespecting the flag, I'm not thinking about anyone in particular. You know, those who say that this is disrespecting the flag are actually missing the point intentionally in order to create a conflict over something that is actually distracting us from the real issue. And so this is why, actually, I have trouble with saying that we need to learn how to talk to one another, because some people in the room, not this room, some people in the room don't want to talk to anybody who's different than they are. And so when we say, I came from Michigan, I lived in Michigan from 1986 to 2009, I know plenty of folks in Michigan who could talk with Black Lives Matter, who are in fact black. It's not just all white Midwestern folks who are, you know, the people we need to talk to. It's one of the tricks of white privilege I would put forward to you. And that is, when we talk, need to say we got to get over our silos. Which silos are we talking about? Because the people who are dispossessed most are the ones who are taken for granted most when we're talking about having to have dialogue across difference.
So I'm going to pick up on two of the points. One, the last one about silos. I don't think in our society today, sadly, we don't want to move across those silos and get over those silos. And in fact, if we think about how our systems, I think of my phone, right? How many of you get notifications on your phone if you use social media? It'll notify you what your friends are posting. That's reinforcing your silo, right? Not many seek notifications from opposing viewpoints or from enemies as opposed to their friends. The whole structure is designed around friends. So it's reinforcing these kinds of silos. And I want to come back to a point that, Eric, you raised in your comment. Don't know, there you are. About the kind of increase in potential for democracy seen through the organization of the women's movement. And it reminds me of what happened in the Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt. As the organization was taking place there, the government shut down the internet for 3 days. Same thing has happened. We can look at a whole series of countries. Brazil shut down WhatsApp recently. London, after the bus attack on London Bridge, they blocked WhatsApp briefly. So we see instances the technology enables those who want to suppress that kind of organization to do so. And our challenge is going to be, and we've seen it in other contexts too, in the Twitterverse on political dialogue, the number of automated bots, artificial intelligence that is used to distort conversations taking place online is actually quite surprising today. And we have plenty of examples and plenty of illustrations where a dialogue starts on a substantive political issue and is totally dwarfed by automated bots seeking to distract. So how we begin to harness that for the side of good, which is the more political participatory positive side, as opposed to the censorial, dictatorial side, is a challenge that we are having great difficulty, and I think a democracy will have great difficulty in being able to negotiate that challenge. Because the minute the state, I think of it as a government organization, tries to structure a conversation, then it means you no longer have a true commitment to free expression.
So I want to just address, I think, a buried orthodoxy here about the media environment and the communication environment that existed prior to the social network platforms. That buried orthodoxy is that there was some period in which we were both aware of and were capable of conversing across silos. This is false. It's completely false, right? So the civil rights movement worked not because there was a conversation across silos, but because there were news cameras showing people something that they were very uncomfortable seeing. It was a world that they didn't know existed when you're talking about the middle of the country. And that's exactly what has continued to happen across all of these conversations in time. Black Lives Matter, I think, is a perfect example of an immensely successful movement because it has driven an extremely uncomfortable conversation about the world that was always there, right? So I had that conversation with my dad about the police. My wife had my wife is white. She had no idea that that conversation existed before she married me. And there's no way for her to know that. And so the platforms are breaking down, or at least making transparent the silos, as opposed to doing anything to. Now, of course, the other side of it is there is some reinforcement within the bubble, but at the same time, so both the inner and the outer ring collude to make it possible for you to see what's happening in Burma right now, right? Unless the New York Times covered it in 1980, I would never know that. And the New York Times, the fact that there is no longer a set of single arbiters of information both confuses and clarifies our view of the world. It's a complicated interaction, but I don't want to leave this with a kind of an orthodoxy around the noble savage previous media environment. So
I want to just reflect on that for a second. I think you're absolutely right that we shouldn't view the Walter Cronkite era as a panacea. I do think it is a remarkable blip in the history of American media in the way that we receive information, right? At the turn of the 20th century, I think there were 1,000 newspapers in New York City. Very few of them had a Chinese wall between editorial and news. They were in different languages, and people were receiving information sort of at a pre-Twitter, right? In the sense that they were receiving information in their community, and there was this brief period in the middle of the 20th century where there were 3 networks, there were a series of newspapers, and they were I'll take your I take the criticism, but I do think that they were they provided a platform on which maybe they weren't breaking down silos themselves, but people in different silos were all reading them. Your example about what's happening in Burma, I don't know that I agree that more people now know what's happening to this Muslim minority that's fleeing to Bangladesh now because of the changed media environment. I would argue in many cases fewer people know, because in their little bubble of Twitter or of Facebook, that's not a topic of conversation. And so that my fear is that in the absence, so we have always had middle ring relationships that mediated in New York City the fact that people were, that their appetite for information was coming in a balkanized world. But when they got on the trolley car or on the train or when they went to work, people were having these conversations across their difference, and that was a middle ring thing. They couldn't avoid it. Now, the silos are such that in a similar media environment, their everyday experience is not breaking out of that experience, so that there is a world of people who are thrilled by the Women's March. There's a world of people who are talking about Black Lives Matter, about the conversation. That there are people, and those are that understanding is deepening. It's not entirely clear to me that the people who live in Kent County or the Macomb County, Michigan, or in other white privileged places are having similar conversations. And I think I believe there are any number of reasons to. I mean, if the modern civil rights movement is the shining example of what sort of impact a social movement can have, and it continues to reverberate today, there is some role here, I think, in suggesting that it was married to a media environment that made it possible. To your point, we had these cameras making these injustices apparent, and it's not clear to me that those cameras reach the same diversity of audience and can have the sort of similar impact today that they did 40 and 50 years ago.
Yes, I know
Okay,
we
yeah,
have
we've got somebody
questions.
in the audience here. Yeah.
So it's Steve Dove, a nonprofit quarterly. I'm going to do something dangerous, which is ask a question that's a genuine question. I really don't know what answers I'm expecting to get. But just thinking about this, if you had this panel, say, in maybe 1951, I don't think you would say that the media environment was going to facilitate the civil rights movement. You would be talking about people being blacklisted, the threat of nuclear war. The likelihood of us even being around to have this conversation in 2017 would have been questioned, right? And so the question, and so it turned out, in hindsight, this is obvious, right? It turned out that the context of the Cold War, the existence of the three-channel broadcast media happened to amplify types of protests that the civil rights movement was able to exploit. But that wasn't obvious in 1951, right? Even though there was organization going on. So, it's 2017. What are we going to say in 2040? That was this, social movement that emerged. That was obvious, that in hindsight was obvious that was going to emerge because of the changed context.
No one wants to predict the future and be proven correct.
So I have a foolish projection, but it's based on the premise that, to borrow the words of a colleague, John Seeley Brown, we live in what he calls a whitewater world. And I think it is much more difficult for us to imagine the alternative futures before us than it was in 1951. Destruction or survival. This is not, part of the agenda, partially because climate change is one scenario we need to think about. We need to think about, kind of raging civil war within the United States. I actually think we're in the midst of a postmodern civil war. within the United States. And the outcome of this is not clear. So one of my premises is that we will be talking about the ways in which this white supremacist movement somehow took over the realm of governmental authority. I believe in the resilience of our institutions, but I also believe in the danger of this racist, misogynist passion. Or we'll be talking about the awakening of a democratic spirit that was about anti-racism, that was about class justice, that was about environmental sanity. Because those, to me, are the alternatives before us. But that is before a world that is so uncertain.
So I also get nervous predicting the future, but I breaking it down into binary outcomes, I think, is an interesting way for us to at least construct a way to think about this. I'll say, in my mind, it's almost certainly the latter, just to use your construction. And the reason is going back to the original argument around the generations. The millennials versus the baby boomers is actually what we're talking about. It's really not issue driven. This is essentially a cultural construct by a generation. The baby boomers are the biggest generation ever, and they are used to running the world, right? The world that we are in is the world that they constructed, basically. And they constructed it against the world that they inherited, right? So that was everything from the civil rights movement to the anti-Vietnam testaments to the women's movement. All these things are the world, they made the world that they wanted. The millennials are gonna do the exact same thing. Because there aren't quite as many of them as were the baby boomers, but there's enough that they're a generation that can stand up to the baby boomers in terms of their ideologies. And their ideologies are relatively consistent across the generation. Now, it's really hard to say any individual is a representative of that, but if you take polls of millennials generally, you will hear exactly the same three things that you just heard. And the people who are not talking like that are a lot older. Right? So your first example was a generational ideology, which we don't love, but actually represents the kind of left behind between 50 and 75 that are angry and they vote a lot. And I think that I have a lot of hope. Like I was having a conversation the other day about a carbon price. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen a lot faster than people think it's gonna happen. Because it's the only actual tool to get to the outcome that we need to. So I do think that we are kind of in the midst of this odd transition, and I completely agree with your assessment that the closest time to this in terms of US history is like 1858, right? That's exactly where we are right now. People talk about 1968, no. It's 1858, and that was, I guess the sad thing for me was that I thought Obama was Lincoln and we'd won, and it turns out he was like the guy before the guy. So I don't know where we're going to be 6 or 7 years from now, but I think it's certainly going to be the old proverb, interesting times.
We've got an audience comment here, and I just want to say, Mackie, I agree with you completely. In fact, I wrote a piece a year ago saying, which former U.S. president is Obama going to be compared to? And my bottom line was James Buchanan. So anyway.
Tough audience.
So with each new comment, there's a thought that one wants to respond to, and you forget the previous one. But that said, there's something about the way we're talking about technology and relating it to two dispensations, if I can term it that way. That is the mid-20th century dispensation of the modern civil rights movement and where we are today. And we talk about the technology as if it is the end. And we, the users of that end, are simply its instruments, when it's the other way around. The three networks and Father Walter Cronkite were really the instruments. And I would argue the African American community of that time understood the instrument. They understood that holding a march at 5 o'clock in the afternoon would get you on TV. That wasn't rocket science. And the higher point, however, is just that. There was an infrastructure within the African American community that this conversation has totally missed. We did talk about the black church, I think, and we talked about the SCLC These were institutions of themselves that are very different today than they were then. Of necessity, those institutions within the African American community serviced and provided an infrastructure, a social infrastructure that made the movement possible that I argue neither the women's movement nor Black Lives Matter has today. There is no women's movement church structure. There is no Black Lives Matter church structure. Let me give you 2 or 3 more, and then I'll leave it at that. The African American community had a whole news and information structure, its own radio stations, or at least directed at African Americans, its own newspapers, colleges and universities, hospitals, businesses. That framework is really what served as the social capital that made the conversation even possible with the broader community. The question is, where are those institutions today, and how do they relate to technology, and not the other way around?
Well, before we, I'm going to have the panel close things out, but I want to get some more comments from the audience before we have to move on to our next thing. We have people on the floor who want to say something. Yeah.
So I work in education, and I've recently become fond of a term from Rothstein and Santana, and the term is micro-democracies, and it's sort of creating sort of micro-democracies in classrooms. And I see that 3 of y'all are professors, and I can tell all of y'all care about the next generation in education. But I like to focus on practices. What would you say maybe some of the practices are of micro-democracies for creating sort of more civic participation in your classrooms? And that's just a question, but comment.
You know, it's not like a bunch of professors not want to talk.
So you can ask, I mean, I have at least one person back there who's been in my classroom, and Vandana, she'll correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I'm a great fan of envisioning democratic change by practicing it in place. And it can be within the classroom, it can be within your institution, it can be within your city, it can be within your state, and so on. So within the classroom, one of the things that's really clear to me is that I put forward an agenda, but then I cede the agenda to those who are designated discussant leaders, right? This is not rocket science, to use the earlier term. But where I see this as being very different is when it moves from a practice in the moment to a systemic reflex that is organized around the idea of accountability. And one of the things that Brown University did over the last several years in response to the challenges around racism and exclusion is to develop a diversity and inclusion action plan that wasn't just filled with ceremonial pomp and circumstance, but actually had mechanisms that were able to designate how accountability can be ensured. So if I were to point to that kind of question, you know, I would look to that accountability. And in regard to the question about where are these communities, you know, one of the things that I'm struck by is that I don't know, but I think they're happening. Because one of the things that's striking to me is that, for instance, within Rhode Island right now, there's a powerful movement to try to transform the terms of discussion about how democracy runs in this state, organized around resist hate and other kinds. These are filled with people in huge town halls that are connected with each other every day through Facebook. And this is changing the terms of democracy itself in Rhode Island, because it's not just a debate about this versus that policy. It's about the question of to whom are elected leaders accountable, and what kinds of conversations can we expect of them. That's where I see the deepening of democracy happening in my beloved state of hope.
So in 1996, this is to respond to this question, before Facebook and Google and any of these things were around, a guy named Alan Ehrenholt wrote a book called The Lost City, which I think is a terrific book, and it goes through the evolution of 3 neighborhoods in Chicago. One, a white working class neighborhood, back of the yards, I think, Tracy, you'll have to.
Yep.
One at Bronzeville and one in sort of a wealthier part of the north side. And what's remarkable is that the very point that you made about the institution changing, he sees the decay, right? There's a big African-American life insurance company in Bronzeville that right, the newspaper dies. There's sort of a sense that the very social architecture, I think you're absolutely right, that social architecture within the community is the foundation for all the things that they accomplish after that, right? They use the media, right? Like the brilliance of having the kids go to the lunch counter in North Carolina, right? Like that's savvy, and there can be savvy today. But that the connections between the members of the SCLC, between the various pastors in their various, like that is the meat of it, and then you build from there. And the question, and I think this is the enduring question, is whether that exists today. How do you have a movement that pursues sustainable social change when you have a quick conversation and you're all outraged by a bigoted teacher in the local elementary school, and you get that person out, and but then everyone flits away, and so it's sort of interesting, and I'll sort of leave it at this. I think Michael's right. There is a growing movement here in Rhode Island. At the same time, if you look at Angus Deaton's work, like in the world of Trump voters, there's a totally different narrative, right? Now, some of it is born of bigotry. You look at some of the social indicators in parts of America where suicide is up, disease is up. No, it's not that they're angry that the local factory closed down. It's that their entire world is falling apart. There's meth, now there's opioids. I mean, the trajectory of their lives, like their life expectancy has diminished. Their conversation is just entirely different. I'm not sure, Maggie, you and I are both focused on what's happening with the Rohingya, right? I'm not sure that the people in these various pockets even know what's happening 3 blocks over. And that is a reflection of the fact that they can spend a bunch of their day following the Cincinnati Bengals, even if they live in Providence, Rhode Island, and also that there are opportunities for them to be in touch with people that they love deeply much more frequently. I think that's a profound shift.
Johnny tells me he must respond, but promised me it will only be 15
I'd
seconds.
like to.
I just can't help but say this, because I should have said it before. There was a function of civil society in the modern civil rights movement, particularly within the black community, African American community, that is a metaphor for what doesn't exist today. That is, there was a certain responsibility and an organization within civil society of necessity that birthed the modern civil rights movement. And that's what we've lost. The role and function and power of civil society has been displaced, and much of that has been diffused through technology itself. And that's how we have to think about the use of technology. Are 15 seconds up? The use of technology and the role of civil society in that use.
I agree with everything you said. It's not just technology, right? Like other things changed. Like we're looking at changes in the 80s and 90s, before Facebook, before the digital revolution, right? The patterns of how we shopped, right? All of those things, how we choose to worship. We no longer worship at the local congregation. We shop for the place that has the liturgy that we like most. Americans now are just as religious, but they are much more likely to go more than a mile away from their home to worship. So there are a whole series of changes, and technology is a part of it.
Let me tell you how I want to just proceed here, because we're going to need to take a break in a couple minutes, and we're going to come back and hear from Kala Vitaro all about technology and how that's changing our world. But before we do that, real quick, I want to ask one particular member of our audience to respond to what was said by the panel earlier, and that's our largest of the overshares from last night, Carl Struble. And then we'll have Joel and Mackie, just give us 1 minute to finish up, and Tracy and I'd like you to conclude things, and we'll take a quick break. And I just want to say real quick, for those of you who missed the import of Michael's comment, if you're from out of state, you may not realize that the state motto of Rhode Island is in fact hope. So it ties into a recurring theme here. Anyway, I'm going to bring the mic over here to Carl. Carl, for those of you who don't know, is one of the leading Democratic media consultants in the country. The other leading Democratic media consultant in the country is Glenn Totten, who's sitting back there. We heard a lot earlier about how the whole world of political discourse is changing as a result of these technologies. Mackey has argued consistently in a couple of different areas that what we're seeing today may be different in quantity to some degree, but it's not really different in quality. This kind of advertising shaping how voters think has been going on for a long time. Joel was pointing out that it's probably not just the Russians. Everybody's doing this. We just don't know about it. This is your business, putting up advertising that moves voters. All this stuff we've been talking about today, how is that changing your job and changing the democratic process as we know it in America?
I think it's chaos. We're in transition now. Just like you said, 3 networks, when I was growing up. Now there are hundreds of networks just on broadcast. This is diffused. And, when I said I wanted to go pull the covers up, it was more in response to you talking about how there's just going to be a gigantic shift in employment. And I fear what that means. That when we have driverless cars, we won't have people driving them, and then that's probably the largest, I think I was told, sector of jobs in America are people that transport things. When you said that we won't need doctors as much, doctors will be put out of work. Well, that is just giant change to society. And when you see the chaos that we have now, that I look at where all these different platforms that you can communicate, that's change, and scary change to a lot of people, because there's no central thing driving thought, and you have chaos in the in the work sector and where people get their jobs, and it probably means there will be fewer, it'll spread out wealth so that there's a bigger difference between the people that own these things and are the leaders of all of this new technology and all the rest of us. I worry that it leads, that I often see out of chaos, people run to authoritarian kinds of figures, and I see Trump as a manifestation of that. So that was why I was thinking about it, is, my God, how do we save democracy? How do the things that I think about fairness that I've fought for my whole life, how do they survive this? How do we harness this? It's hard to get your head around it. So, I mean, I'm sitting here, in a state of, and I've felt this way for a while, that the change is happening. I'm about ready to pass this on to a whole lot of people. I got 1 or 2 cycles left, that's it. And I want to elect people that care about society and not just about themselves. And I see that the fundamental difference between what I think is going on in politics and in America and around the world. And so it's scary it should be scary to all of us, quite frankly, because I don't think it's clear what will happen out of it. So that's why I was pulling my heads over it. And I don't know if I made any sense whatsoever about trying to bring some of this together, but for me, as a practical person that elects Democrats and people that care about something other than themselves, it's how do I speak and motivate people and change behavior? Because I don't like the direction it has been going, and I hope there's a backlash in America. I see evidence of that to some degree, but how do I harness that backlash to take control of Congress and impeach this bastard?
Right. Thanks, Carl. Okay. Well, Joel, then Mackie, 1 minute each, and then Tracy, you can send us off to the break.
Thanks. I'm supposed to follow that? Well, I guess I'll come back with where I start. I mean, I think everything I've heard in the conversation here and with the participants confirms my pre-held view. It's always that way, isn't it? That we're in a transitional moment. And I think it was very interesting, the discussion we had about the missing social structures that existed in the early civil rights movement that we don't see happening today. There's another side to that, which is that even if they were to exist, their strategies to be able to get information out would have to be very different. Because in the world of 3 channels, it was easy. You knew if at 5 o'clock you showed up and the TV cameras were there, it'd be all across the news nationwide. Today, if you're not on the first page of Google search results, you don't exist. And that is algorithmically driven. The technology designed for the search results is not neutral. It's values baked. And I think we have to, going forward, begin to define how do we decide when it's okay to hack Facebook? How do we decide when it's okay to hack the government? Or when the government can hack private entities? Because I think we're going to see a world where the actors who we will look to assure our public values will not be the state, and we will still have to look to the state in other instances to say be the check on Google's and Facebook's. And it's a world that's going, I share that view, is going to be very chaotic for a while, and I think very difficult to sort out.
Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar is a phrase from a Wallace Stevens poem in the beginning part of the 20th century. It's really an allegory for modernity and the relationship between humanity and technology. And so I agree with all that was said before. We are in a period of significant flux, but I do think that flux is likely to result in an outcome, as things have historically. The arc of history bends towards justice. It is, in my mind, completely obvious when you look at it over a long period of time. And it's scary for us because there's an event horizon. We can't see beyond it. And we are in a period right now of what I would call increasing uncertainty, where there's lots of low likelihood events that suddenly become very high likelihood events very quickly. That's scary. But it's also the world that my children are born into, and they are they're going to be much more comfortable operating in this level of uncertainty and chaos. The same way that, and I think part of a significant part of our agita comes from the fact that all of us up here, including me, grew up in a Cold War period in which the world was binary, artificially simple. And to your earlier point about the media environment prior to television, when we had 10,000 newspapers or 1,000 newspapers in New York City, that's a lot more like now. So we lived through and were reared during a strange interregnum in the global chaos that has been human society for 1 million years. And we're kind of now struggling through a return to that essentially base state of the world. And I do think that the younger generations are just going to be much more adept at navigating that. They have to be.
We began this morning with my unnecessarily reminding you that we're talking about very big ideas and asking very big questions. And I'm thrilled to see just how pink our artwork is behind us, but we have certainly woven in many topics, cultural institutions, social forces, and so on. And in my closing remarks, I want to just remind everyone, perhaps unexpectedly, that today about 100 people are going to die. They're going to die because they abused opioids, overdosed, and died. It is a crisis beyond what this country ever saw at the height of the AIDS epidemic. It is destroying communities that are already suffering from a lack and an eroding socioeconomic base. It is cross-cutting gender. It is cross-cutting class. It is increasingly cross-cutting race. It is a public health emergency. It's an economic emergency. You can pick up any paper, regardless of its leaning, and you can read a heart-wrenching story about coroners who can't take it anymore, funeral homes that can't process the bodies, doctors and nurses who don't even know what to do next. Then last weekend, we saw on 60 Minutes, in conjunction with the Washington Post, that the DEA and Congress were actually in cahoots with the manufacturers of pills, and that there's been a very nefarious reinforcing mechanisms between Congress and the companies to, in fact, sell more pills that are killing Americans. I raise this because I believe it touches on all of the big concepts we've talked about. It touches about where we are at this moment in history. It touches about how we get our information. And it also touches on this notion that we believe there's a benevolence in our government. Is the DEA not a benevolent organization? Well, it turns out that's been thrown into question as well. And so as we pursue the defense of democracy and as we continue to embrace the greater good, happening right among us and probably outside of this very hotel, you have an unprecedented crisis in this country. And so for the talk of the big terms and the big ideas, we have singular deaths happening all around us in this city and where all of us live. And so I say this not as the world's biggest buzzkill to end this panel, but rather because I think that's the whole point of this. We can all talk in our big ideas with our big questions and our big concepts. I trained as a sociologist. I care deeply about these ideas, and I believe in the preservation and furthering of this knowledge. But I also believe that as political actors, we have a responsibility. And I hope that that translates into that currently blank item up there about things we're inspired to do. And I'm grateful for all of these gentlemen's very candid and important thoughts, and I'm grateful for your enthusiasm and questions, and I hope everyone's caffeine has hit, and I look forward to the rest of this. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks to the panel.